Pelican Bay Supermax, where inmates vanish into silence. The vanishing. The sound of heavy steel doors slamming shut echoes like thunder. Inside, a man is dragged by guards into a concrete room barely bigger than a bathroom. The walls are cold, gray and bare. The only window is a tiny slot, no bigger than the palm of a hand, letting in a faint line of sunlight. Here, inside Pelican Bay State Prison's Supermax security housing unit, men don't just serve time, they disappear. No voices. No touch. No human contact for years. Some inmates whisper that Pelican Bay is not a prison, but a place where people are buried alive. And as one inmate presses his ear to the wall, desperate for a single human sound, the silence swallows him whole. This is where inmates vanish into silence. But how did this prison become the final stop for the most dangerous men in America? And what really happens inside these walls, where silence itself becomes a weapon? Let's start at the beginning. The birth of a monster. In the late 1980s, California's prison system was spiraling out of control. Gangs ruled the yards. Violence was daily. Murders happened faster than the guards could count. The state needed a solution, something stronger, harsher, deadlier. And so, in 1989, the government built Pelican Bay State Prison on the remote northern coast of California, surrounded by forests and fog. It wasn't just another prison. This was a fortress. Concrete walls, razor wire, and watchtowers designed not just to contain men, but to erase them from the outside world. At the heart of it was the SHU, the Security Housing Unit, a place of pure isolation. But as the first inmates were marched inside, whispers spread across the prison system. If you land in Pelican Bay, you'll vanish into silence. For years that silence broke men down slowly. But then, something exploded. In 1992, guards discovered a gruesome message. An inmate stabbed more than 70 times in the exercise yard. His body left as a warning. This was just the beginning of Pelican Bay's blood-soaked history. The gang wars in the shadows. Inside Pelican Bay, the SHU wasn't just a prison block. It became the headquarters of prison gangs. The Mexican Mafia. The Aryan Brotherhood. The Black Guerrilla Family. All locked away, yet all pulling strings on the outside. Gang leaders used coded notes, smuggled letters, even messages hidden in artwork to control entire drug empires and street murders. All while sitting alone in silence. For guards, every day was a chess match against invisible players. And for the inmates trapped inside, there was no escape. Some men refused to join gangs. They thought silence would protect them. But inside Pelican Bay, silence didn't mean safety. One morning, an inmate stepped into the small concrete yard for his exercise. Another inmate rushed him with a sharpened piece of metal. Within seconds, the yard ran red. Guards fired warning shots, but the killing was already done. Life inside the box. The SHU cells at Pelican Bay are designed to break people. Each cell is about 8 feet by 10 feet, just enough for a bed, a toilet, and a small desk bolted to the wall. Prisoners spend 22 to 23 hours a day locked inside with no phone calls, no contact visits, and no programs. The only time they see the outside is when they're escorted, shackled, to a small concrete yard. A yard so high-walled it looks like a drained swimming pool. Inmates describe it as living in a world of gray. Some start talking to themselves. Some scream through the cracks in the door. Others just go silent forever. But in a place designed for silence, even the smallest sound can mean danger. One night, guards patrolling the tier smelled smoke. They rushed to find a cell engulfed in flames. An inmate had set himself on fire, choosing death over another day in silence. The hunger strike. By the early 2010s, Pelican Bay inmates had reached a breaking point. Decades in silence, with no chance of release from the SHU, drove many to desperate measures. In 2011, thousands of inmates launched a mass hunger strike. They refused meals, demanding basic human rights: sunlight, phone calls, an end to decades-long isolation. For weeks, men wasted away in their cells, their bodies shrinking but their voices finally heard outside the walls. Families rallied. Human rights groups called Pelican Bay's SHU torture. And for a moment, it seemed silence might finally break. But Pelican Bay had one last chilling reminder that it was built to bury men alive. The Cold War of silence. The prison wasn't only about concrete and steel, it was about control. Guards at Pelican Bay learned early that silence itself could be used as a weapon. No music. No laughter. No voices. The SHU blocks were designed with soundproofing so strong that inmates couldn't even hear the man in the cell next to them. Days passed like ghosts, one blending into the next. For some, the silence was worse than violence. One inmate later wrote, "It's like being buried alive except your heart still beats." But silence didn't always last. Sometimes tiny cracks appeared. Inmates banged codes on pipes, whispering to each other through vents. These small signals became lifelines, a way to prove they still existed. Yet even a whisper could mean punishment. If caught, inmates were stripped, searched, and sometimes denied their hour of yard time. In 1995, a young inmate broke the silence by screaming for hours, clawing at the walls until his hands bled. Guards rushed in, but when they opened his cell they found him collapsed, eyes staring blankly. He had lost his mind to the silence. The code of the gangs. 4 gang leaders inside Pelican Bay, silence was just a mask. Behind those walls, they plotted wars that stretched across California. The Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and Nuestra Familia used Pelican Bay as a control tower. Each coded message that slipped through the cracks could mean a street execution hundreds of miles away. In the SHU, art wasn't just art. A drawing of an Aztec warrior might actually hide orders for a drug shipment. A birthday card sent to a family could carry the names of men marked for death. Guards called this the Cold War of ink and paper. They intercepted letters, confiscated drawings, and tried to decode hidden signals. But the gangs always found another way. For regular inmates, survival meant obeying the unwritten rules. Refuse and you'd vanish into silence, permanently. In 2000, a shocking discovery was made. Guards opened a letter sent from the SHU to Los Angeles. Inside was a death order, a green light on a rival gang member. Days later, that man was gunned down on the street. Pelican Bay's silence had reached the outside world. The yard of shadows. Exercise in the SHU wasn't freedom. Each inmate was escorted, shackled, handcuffed, and strip-searched, before being placed in a concrete yard. But the yard wasn't green grass or open air. It was a 20 by 30 foot box with walls so high you could barely see the sky. Prisoners called it the dog run. No sun. No trees. Just gray concrete and silence. Some paced in circles. Others did push-ups until their arms gave out. Many simply sat, staring at the sky through the narrow slit above, wondering if the world had forgotten them. But the yard wasn't always empty. Sometimes, guards placed 2 inmates in together, rivals, enemies, or even gang members under suspicion. It was like throwing 2 wolves into a cage. In 1998, 2 inmates were released into the same yard. At first they circled quietly. Then without warning one lunged. Hidden in his waistband was a sharpened piece of metal. By the time guards fired live rounds to stop him, the other inmate lay motionless in the corner, another life swallowed by Pelican Bay's silence. The Hunger Games of survival. Survival inside Pelican Bay wasn't just about gangs or guards, it was about food. Inmates relied on 2 things, prison meals and the commissary. But meals were often cold, bland, and repetitive, trays of mushy beans, bread hard as stone, and mystery meat that inmates swore was unfit for dogs. Some prisoners refused to eat, claiming the food itself was another form of punishment. Others turned to the commissary where packaged noodles, chips, and candy bars became more valuable than money. A bag of ramen noodles could buy you protection. A Snickers bar could buy you silence. Yet food also became a weapon. If an inmate crossed a gang, his commissary could be stolen, his tray flipped onto the floor. Hunger turned men into animals. In 2005, guards discovered an inmate who hadn't eaten in days. His body was frail, his commissary untouched. The reason? A gang had placed him on a blacklist. If he touched food he would be killed. Starved by silence, he died in his cell. The silent revolt. By the 2010s, whispers of revolt grew louder. The hunger strikes weren't just about food, they were about decades of isolation. Some inmates had spent 20 years straight inside the SHU, with no hope of release unless they informed on gangs. But snitching meant death. So many stayed silent. In 2011, over 6,000 inmates across California joined Pelican Bay in refusing meals. It was the largest hunger strike in state history. News cameras gathered outside. Families held signs reading, "Silence is torture." For the first time, the world looked into the gray walls of Pelican Bay. Inside, men grew weaker by the day. Some collapsed. Some were rushed to the hospital. Others clung to life, determined not to break. The prison system was forced to negotiate. The silence was finally cracking. But just as hope seemed near, one inmate was found dead in his cell. His body curled on the floor, lips cracked, stomach empty. He had become a martyr of Pelican Bay's silence. The court stepped in. By the early 2010s, the outside world could no longer ignore Pelican Bay. Human rights lawyers, families of inmates, and even former guards testified that the SHU wasn't just a prison block, it was a form of psychological torture. Some inmates had spent 25 years without touching another human being. Others described hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing shadows, feeling insects crawling on their skin. Doctors warned that long-term isolation was destroying men's minds. The lawsuits came pouring in. Civil rights groups demanded the SHU be dismantled. The state fought back, claiming isolation was necessary to control gangs. For a while, it seemed the walls of silence would never crack. But pressure grew. Judges began to ask the same haunting question: is this justice or cruelty? In 2012, during a court hearing, one inmate broke down in tears as he described spending decades in a cell without touching his family. His story went viral, and suddenly Pelican Bay's silence wasn't just a secret anymore. The fall of the SHU. After years of battles, something unthinkable happened. In 2015, California reached a landmark settlement. The indefinite solitary confinement system at Pelican Bay was over. Thousands of inmates who had spent decades in the SHU were promised release back into general population, or even transfer to lower security prisons. For the first time in decades, men who had lived in silence would hear voices, see crowds, and walk in open yards. But freedom came with fear. Some of these men were broken by years in isolation. They didn't know how to talk to others, how to live in groups, how to sleep without silence. For them, the outside world felt louder than a war zone. Still, the fall of the SHU was hailed as a victory. Families celebrated. Lawyers claimed justice was finally served. But not everyone believed Pelican Bay's story was over. Within weeks of SHU inmates being released into the general prison population, a violent riot erupted. Old gang rivalries flared. Blood covered the yard. Pelican Bay's silence had been broken, but it had unleashed chaos. Shadows of the past. Even after the official end of indefinite solitary, Pelican Bay remained haunted. Many inmates carried scars from years of silence. Some refused to leave their cells even when given the chance. They had become so used to isolation that the noise of the yard was unbearable. Guards noticed strange behaviors. Men pacing for hours. Others muttering to themselves, staring at invisible figures. Some refused to speak at all, trapped in silence long after the doors had opened. And the gangs? They didn't disappear. Even with the SHU reduced, leaders still found ways to communicate. Pelican Bay's walls couldn't silence them completely. Outside, activists pushed for full closure of the prison. But the state refused. For officials, Pelican Bay remained necessary, a place to hold the men who were too dangerous, too violent, too unpredictable for anywhere else. In 2018, during a rare family visit, an inmate who had just been released from years in the SHU attacked another prisoner without warning. The silence had broken him, and Pelican Bay proved once again that even outside the SHU, its ghost lived on. Life after silence. For inmates who left Pelican Bay, freedom was never simple. Some were paroled after decades in isolation. They walked into a world of smartphones, fast food chains, and crowded streets, things they hadn't seen in 20 or even 30 years. But silence had carved deep scars. One former inmate described going to a grocery store and freezing in the aisle. The colors, the people, the sounds, it was too much. He broke down crying, unable to take a single step. Others found themselves waking up at night, sweating, hearing the slam of steel doors in their dreams. Some begged their parole officers to let them return to solitary, because it was the only world they understood. And for many, reuniting with family was bittersweet. Children had grown up without them. Parents had passed away. Decades of silence had stolen time they could never get back. In one heartbreaking case, a man released after 20 years in Pelican Bay's SHU died by suicide just months after parole. The silence he carried inside followed him into freedom. The legacy of silence. Today, Pelican Bay is still standing. The SHU no longer holds men indefinitely, but the building remains, a reminder of what once happened there. For some, Pelican Bay is proof of strength. Officials argue it kept the most dangerous inmates locked down, preventing chaos in other prisons. For others, it's a symbol of cruelty, a place where silence was weaponized and men were buried alive inside concrete cells. Journalists, filmmakers, and former inmates continue to tell the stories. Each testimony adds another piece to the puzzle. A prison where silence broke more than chains, it broke souls. And even now, when the fog rolls in from the coast and settles on the prison walls, guards say you can feel it, the weight of silence pressing down. In 2021, a documentary crew visiting Pelican Bay interviewed a former guard. His final words sent chills through viewers. You think the SHU is empty now? No. The silence is still there. Once it gets inside you, it never leaves. The guard's burden. Pelican Bay's silence didn't only crush inmates, it weighed heavily on the guards too. Every shift began with the same ritual: pat-downs, metal detectors, weapons checks. Then came the slow walk into the SHU, where even guards described the air as heavier, colder. Unlike other prisons, there was no noise. No shouting from tiers, no fights breaking out on the yard. Just the eerie hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clang of steel doors. For many officers, this silence was unsettling. Some admitted they spoke louder than usual just to hear their own voices. Others developed insomnia, their ears ringing with phantom echoes of doors slamming shut. But guards had a darker burden: control. They were the only human contact most inmates had. A word, a glance, even the way they placed a tray of food could mean life or death for the men inside. In 2019, a former officer confessed in an interview that he'd seen inmates beg for execution, rather than return to their cells. His chilling words: they didn't want to escape. They just wanted the silence to stop. The famous ghosts of Pelican Bay. Not all inmates who vanished into Pelican Bay were nameless. Some carried reputations that followed them across the world. Arturo Castellanos, a high-ranking Mexican mafia member. He spent decades in Pelican Bay's SHU, allegedly running criminal networks from inside silence. Todd Ashker, the man who became the voice of the hunger strikes. From his SHU cell, he helped organize thousands of prisoners, proving even silence couldn't mute resistance. Shorty, a gang enforcer whose nickname echoed on the streets of Los Angeles. By the time he entered Pelican Bay, his power was gone. Inside the SHU, his voice faded and he died almost forgotten. These names became legends, not because of what they did outside but because of how silence consumed them inside. One inmate, once a feared shot caller, was found curled on his bed, refusing to speak a single word for over a year. Guards called him the Ghost. His body lived on, but his voice had vanished forever. Attempts at escape. Pelican Bay was built to be escape-proof. Remote location. Towers. Double fences. Armed guards. And yet, rumors always spread. Some inmates believed there were tunnels under the SHU. Others whispered about bribed guards or stolen keys. Over the years, small attempts surfaced. Smuggled hacksaw blades, ropes made from sheets, even a plan to cut through the thick concrete walls. But Pelican Bay wasn't like Rikers or county jails. No one ever made it out. Every attempt ended the same: silence. Caught. Punished. Buried deeper inside. In 2007, guards found an inmate unconscious in his cell, his hands bloodied from clawing at the vent above his bed. He wasn't trying to escape the prison, he was trying to escape the silence. The psychologist's warning. Doctors and psychologists who studied Pelican Bay gave chilling testimonies. They described solitary confinement as a living laboratory of madness. Men who once were strong became shells of themselves. Some developed paranoia, convinced the guards were poisoning their food. Others refused to sleep, terrified they'd never wake up. A few began mutilating themselves, carving words or shapes into their skin just to feel something real. Doctors warned that after months, let alone years, in such conditions the human brain begins to unravel. Pelican Bay wasn't just punishing crime, it was rewriting the mind. One psychiatrist recalled entering a SHU cell and finding an inmate rocking back and forth, whispering a single phrase over and over: "The silence is eating me. The outside world speaks." By now, Pelican Bay had become infamous. Journalists compared it to medieval dungeons. Activists called it America's hidden torture chamber. Families traveled miles to Crescent City, only to sit behind glass partitions, speaking through phones to loved ones they hadn't touched in decades. Children grew up knowing their fathers only as faces behind glass. Wives and mothers wrote letters, unsure if the silence swallowed them before they could be read. For many families, visiting Pelican Bay wasn't hope, it was heartbreak. They left feeling as though their loved ones were already buried. But these voices, families, activists, former guards, finally pierced the walls. Pressure mounted. Courts demanded reforms. In 2014, a documentary showed footage of Pelican Bay's SHU for the first time. Millions of viewers watched in shock. One chilling image stood out: a gray cell, bare and silent, with only the faint scratch marks of an inmate who had tried to count the days. Today's Pelican Bay. So what is Pelican Bay now? The SHU, once a symbol of silence, no longer buries men indefinitely. California was forced to end that practice. Many cells are empty. But the building remains, like a tomb. The prison still holds thousands and violence hasn't disappeared. Riots break out. Gangs still fight for control. But the days of keeping men locked in silence for decades are fading. Still, the scars remain. Former inmates carry the weight of Pelican Bay with them forever. Some never recover. Others use their voices to warn the world, writing books, speaking at rallies, or testifying about what silence can do to the human mind. Yet in 2022, guards reported something chilling. During a routine inspection of the SHU, one officer swore he heard a voice whisper through the vents, even though the unit was completely empty. The monster among prisons. Pelican Bay wasn't just another facility. It became a blueprint for extreme control. Other states studied it, other wardens envied it. They saw a place where riots could be silenced and gangs could be buried behind walls. But what outsiders didn't see was the cost. Pelican Bay was never filled with first-time offenders or small-time criminals. It was filled with the hardest cases, lifers, gang leaders, men who had spilled blood inside and outside prison walls. These men, once violent and loud, were now trapped in concrete boxes. The silence didn't just hold them, it consumed them. Some were broken. Others became sharper, colder, deadlier. In this way, Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a factory. A place that turned violent men into shadows, and shadows into legends whispered across the system. In 1993, a federal judge toured Pelican Bay and was shocked to see inmates so pale, they looked like they hadn't seen sunlight in years. His words spread through headlines, "This is a place where men are entombed." The world had been warned, but the silence rolled on. The broken minds. Silence wasn't just physical. It carved into the mind. Psychologists who visited Pelican Bay reported a disturbing pattern. Men forgot how to talk. Some sat motionless for hours, staring at walls. Others developed what doctors called SHU syndrome, a condition where isolation caused hallucinations, paranoia, and emotional collapse. One inmate believed insects crawled across his skin. Another was convinced the guards had planted microphones inside his teeth. A few stopped eating, muttering that their food was poisoned. And yet, the system kept them inside. Days turned into years. Years into decades. In one chilling case, an inmate gouged out his own eye and mailed it to the courts as proof of his suffering. Even then, officials argued the SHU was necessary. The riots of noise. Though silence ruled the SHU, Pelican Bay's general yards told another story. Here, gangs clashed openly. The Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family treated the prison as a battlefield. Fights could spark over anything: a stolen radio, a debt unpaid, a look held too long. Guards responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, even live rounds. Still, the violence never stopped. For inmates, silence and noise were two sides of the same coin. In the SHU, you vanished into stillness. In the yard, you drowned in chaos. In 2015, just weeks after SHU reforms, over 80 inmates clashed in a massive yard riot. Stabbing after stabbing unfolded before guards regained control. Silence had ended, but the price was blood. The forgotten families. Outside Pelican Bay's towering walls, families carried their own burden. Mothers and wives traveled for hours, sometimes days, just to see loved ones for an hour behind glass. Children grew up staring at fathers through scratched visiting windows, unable to hug them. Letters became lifelines. Every envelope carried hope. But for many there was no reply. Some inmates had been in silence so long they no longer wrote back. Others forgot how to carry conversations. One woman described her husband after 15 years in the SHU. "He wasn't the man I married. He was a ghost." In 2010, a child visiting her father in Pelican Bay collapsed in tears, crying, "Daddy, why don't you talk anymore?" Her father stayed silent, staring at the floor. Silence had stolen his voice, and his family's hope. The end that never ends. Even now, Pelican Bay's story isn't finished. The SHU no longer buries men forever, but the prison itself remains a fortress. A reminder. A shadow. For inmates still inside, the fear of silence lingers. They know what those walls can do. For guards, the memory of lifeless eyes and endless quiet haunts their careers. For families, Pelican Bay stands as the graveyard of time. And for the world outside, it raises a question. When silence becomes punishment, how much of a man is left when the doors finally open? In 2023, a former SHU inmate gave his first public speech after release. When asked what silence felt like, he paused for nearly a full minute before answering in a whisper, "I am still inside." The case of Todd Ashker. Todd Ashker wasn't a street name that scared the public, but inside Pelican Bay he became a symbol. Locked in the SHU for over 20 years, Ashker lived in silence that most can't even imagine. His cell became his entire world, a gray box, a steel bed, and the sound of his own breath. But Ashker refused to disappear. Using letters smuggled out through lawyers, he became one of the leaders of the 2011 hunger strikes. His words, scratched on paper and passed beyond the walls, united thousands of inmates across California. He described solitary as a form of death. They are burying us alive in concrete tombs. Ashker's resistance forced the world to look at Pelican Bay's silence. But the price was high. Decades of his life vanished into the gray. During one interview, Ashker admitted that after years of silence, he no longer trusted his own memory. He feared his mind was slipping, proving the silence was winning even as he fought back. The ghost of Shorty. Shorty was once a feared gang enforcer in Los Angeles. On the streets, his name carried weight. Inside Pelican Bay, it meant nothing. Sent to the SHU, Shorty's power disappeared. His voice, once loud and commanding, grew weaker. Over the years, he stopped speaking altogether. Guards said he would just stare, unblinking, at the wall for hours. Other inmates whispered about him. Shorty's still here, but he's gone. The silence didn't kill him physically, but it erased him. His gang replaced him. His family stopped visiting. By the time he died in his cell, no one came to claim his body. When guards cleared out Shorty's cell, they found his wall covered with faint scratches, endless tally marks, rows upon rows, as if he'd been counting the days, and then gave up. The story of Arturo Castellanos. Arturo Castellanos, a high-ranking figure in the Mexican mafia, entered Pelican Bay as a man with power stretching from prison to the streets. Even in silence, he commanded respect. But Castellanos learned that Pelican Bay's walls didn't just cage the body, they strangled control. Messages became harder to send. Communication lines broke down. The empire he once ruled began to crumble. Still, officials claimed he continued orchestrating violence from inside his cell, proof that Pelican Bay's silence couldn't silence everyone. For him, the SHU wasn't the end, it was a throne carved out of concrete. One intercepted letter revealed Castellanos had ordered a murder hundreds of miles away, from inside the SHU. The victim was found dead in the streets of Los Angeles. Even in silence, blood still flowed. The man who lost time. Some inmates inside Pelican Bay weren't gang leaders or notorious killers. Some were forgotten men. One prisoner, sentenced for robbery, ended up in the SHU after refusing gang orders. He wasn't a leader, not even violent. But once labeled, he was locked away year after year. He wrote in his journal, "The silence is worse than chains. I don't know if it's been 5 years or 15. By the time reforms came, his body was older, frailer. The world outside had moved on. His children were adults. His parents had died. His entire life had been swallowed by silence. When finally released into general population, he walked into the yard, froze, and collapsed. The noise of men talking, laughing, shouting, after decades in silence, was too much for his mind to handle. The final whisper. Pelican Bay's SHU may no longer bury men indefinitely, but the legacy remains. Former inmates carry it in their voices, or in their silence. Some became advocates, warning the world about the cost of isolation. Others couldn't cope, choosing death over freedom. And many remain locked away, their stories unfinished, their voices unheard. The prison itself still stands. Concrete walls. Razor wire. Guard towers. A monument to America's war on crime, and the silence that war created. Even now, people say if you walk past the SHU at night, you can feel it. The silence pressing against the glass, waiting to swallow the next man whole. A journalist once asked a guard what it was like to work in Pelican Bay's SHU. The guard replied quietly, "You don't work here. You disappear with them." Everyone vanishes into the silence. The silent war within. Even as the SHU emptied, Pelican Bay's silence remained inside the men who lived there. Some described leaving isolation as stepping into another planet. The sound of voices felt like explosions. The brightness of the sun made them sick. Many inmates developed what doctors called institutional silence. They carried the SHU inside their minds, unable to connect, unable to feel. Some avoided crowds, some refused to speak at all. The SHU had ended, but the war was still being fought inside their heads. One man, free after 25 years in silence, sat in a park surrounded by people. When asked how he felt, he whispered, "I don't belong here. My world is still gray." The forgotten cells. The SHU still stands inside Pelican Bay, rows of gray concrete cells, empty now but heavy with memory. Guards walk past, their footsteps echoing against the walls. Some officers admit they refuse to go inside. The cells feel haunted, they say, not by ghosts but by the silence itself. Scratches remain on some walls. Faded graffiti. Numbers etched into steel. Marks left by men desperate not to vanish completely. During a tour in 2020, an advocate leaned into one of the old SHU cells. She swore she heard a faint voice whispering through the vent, "I'm still here." The legacy of Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay is still one of America's most infamous prisons. For some, it represents safety, a place where the most dangerous criminals were controlled. For others, it's a scar on justice, a reminder that silence can be more brutal than chains. The hunger strikes, the lawsuits, the testimonies, all carved Pelican Bay into history. Not just as a prison, but as a symbol of America's darkest form of punishment. Today, debates still rage. Do places like Pelican Bay keep society safe, or do they destroy what makes us human? One former warden, reflecting on his years inside, said quietly, "Pelican Bay didn't just hold prisoners. It erased men. And sometimes it erased us too." Where silence never ends. Pelican Bay was built to cage the most dangerous men in America. But in the process, it created something far more chilling. A world where silence itself was the punishment. Inside those concrete walls, voices faded. Families lost their fathers, sons, and brothers. Not to execution, not to violence, but to disappearance inside living tombs. Some men resisted. Some broke. Some became shadows. And though the SHU no longer swallows men for decades, its legacy lives on in every scar, every whisper, every man who still carries the silence with him. Pelican Bay is not just a prison. It's a reminder of what happens when punishment turns into disappearance. And even today, in the fog of Crescent City, you can look at those walls and wonder, how many voices were buried in Pelican Bay's silence?